Hello, class. So 2 weeks ago we talked about social influence. So today we're going to continue to discuss a similar topic, that is attitude change. How do we change other people's attitude? How do we change our attitude? What are the factors at play? So let's go on. So this is learning outcome number one. All right. So let's talk about what is attitude. What is an attitude? And I really like Kurlansky definitions of attitude. That is, it is a mental structure with an evaluative component. Right. So if you remember back to um, our discussion of cognitive structure and schema, attitude is basically is a schema with an evaluative component. For example, if I have an attitude about Yopo, um, I would have a mental representations of Yopo that is connected with another mental representation that indicate my attitude toward Yopo, which is liking. I especially enjoy going to Yopo. So attitude is just another mental representation. So it's very similar to other cognitive structures that we have talked about before. And so the evaluative component of attitude have two characteristics. One is valence, whether it's positive or negative, whether we like or dislike something, whether we find something pleasant or unpleasant. And then we have magnitude, which is the degree to which the strength of our attitude or the extreme of our attitude, whether we really like something or we only like it slightly, or the same thing for dislike. And so our attitude about things are on a continuum, right? We don't either like or dislike. We like or dislike things with different degree, from hating, neutral to love. For example, if we think about Duke, Virginia U, UVA, or Carolina, um, we might really dislike Duke, feeling neutral toward UVA, or maybe slightly negative, depends on whether we feel like we have some kind of sport rivalry with them or not. And we like Carolina a lot. And so these these guys are called attitude targets, and they're basically the subjects of our evaluations, the things that we evaluate whether we like or dislike. So the extremity of our evaluative component represent the attitude strength. So the more extreme attitude we have about something, the stronger the attitude is, right? So here's a critical thinking exercise. How can you increase the strength of your attitude toward something? I'll give you guys a few seconds to pause the video and jot down some ideas. What would happen that would make your attitude towards something to become stronger? All right. Assuming you guys have paused the video and jotted down some ideas, here are some way that attitude strength is increased. It could be increased through having more experience. So when we have an attitude about something that is more personal, that we have personal experience with or a lot of experience with, for example, if you go to a lot of basketball game with and you do a lot of things that sort of related to basketball, and being a Tar Heel fan, you might have a stronger attitude toward the home team and against our rivalry, which is Duke. So the more experience you have about that domain, about that that build up your attitude, the stronger your attitude is. The second factor is whether we have respected peer around us that hold a certain attitude. So if the peer around us, whom we like, have a certain attitude that or share the attitude with us, then it typically increase our attitude strength. It make our attitude become stronger. And the third factor is cognitive accessibility. So how accessible our attitude is to us. And how do we increase the accessibility of our attitude? There's a variety of ways. Like sometimes maybe there's an environmental cue that sort of like trigger the representations of that attitude, make it more accessible to us. For example, like if you are in a psychology study, the experimenter might prime an attitude and thus making that attitude more accessible to you. But naturally, the the more frequent you have an attitude, the more accessible that attitude would be to you. And vice versa, the more frequent, right? So the more accessible an attitude is to you, the more easily it's get activated frequently. And so it's kind of a feedback loop that make an attitude become stronger and stronger for you. And why do we care about attitude? There's two reasons. One is that attitude predicts behavior. So if I know your attitude about something, I could reasonably predict your behavior in certain situations. For example, if I know that you're a Tar Heel fan, and you're in like a clothing store, you have the choice among buying 3 T-shirt, you probably will not buy Duke T-shirt or a UVA T-shirt. You probably are more likely to buy a Carolina T-shirt. And secondly, knowing that attitude predict behaviors, or lead to behavior, we could try to influence behavior by influencing somebody's attitude. So this is learning outcome number 2. And to clarify, the A and B here, if you guys remember, represent attitude and behavior. All right, so let's talk about, let's take an example. Do you like recycling as an attitude? So probably I'm assuming the majority of you or a lot of you would feel positive about recycling. Now let's think back on the last time that you did not recycle. How long ago was it? Can you think of one? You might be able to think of one incident when you didn't recycle, right? So your attitude and your behavior. Oh yeah, here's the picture for not recycling. So your attitude and behavior is not always consistent, right? We don't always behave consistently with our belief. And there's there's an entire field of research that study attitude behavior consistency. Under what conditions is our attitude and behavior more consistent than not, and what is the repercussion of attitude and behavior inconsistency? So let's talk about what situations or what characteristic would create attitude and behavior consistency. So the characteristic of the attitude is really important for this outcome. So when we have a strongly held attitude that is repeatedly activated, we're more likely to act in line with that attitude. For example, think about recycling, right? If you have a really strong attitude about recycling, you probably more frequently recycle than if you have a weak attitude or you have kind of like yeah, recycling is nice, but sometimes I don't do it, right? The second factor is that if an attitude is specific, is more likely to predict a behavior in a specific situations, or it is more likely to be consistent with the behavior in that specific situations. Take an example. How do you feel about Duke? from extremely unfavorable to extremely favorable. Um, so that attitude is kind of general, right? It's like, oh, I like Duke, I dislike Duke. Mm. So would that attitude predict how you act toward a Duke basketball fan, let's say in the stadium or during a match? Probably. Would this attitude affect how you would behave or treat a, let's say, a psychology researcher from Duke? Maybe not. Um, so even though I might kind of being like sort of slightly antagonistic toward a Duke basketball fan, um, I would have a positive attitude toward a Duke psychology researchers, right? So a more specific an attitude is, the better it is at predicting a specific behavior. So general attitude won't do as well as specific attitude. The third factor is how central this attitude is to your identity. Right? Does this attitude represent your deep values, your deepest belief, or are they kind of like not really important to your personal identity? Um, and also, really importantly, do you have personal experience with this attitude? If you had experienced something that kind of caused you to have this attitude, then the attitude is more important to you, more central to your personhood. And the more central an attitude is, the more likely that you would behave inconsistent with this attitude. For example, political attitude or attitude about moral issues tend to be more central than, let's say, attitude about someone's favorite color. Um, yeah, or like what you want to have for breakfast, right? Because the moral attitudes or behavioral attitude tend to be more central to someone deeper value. And finally, like we have discussed, attitude that is more accessible uh, in a momentarily. For example, it might be cued by something from the environment, or you might be primed with an attitude that make the mental representation of this attitude more accessible. Then you're more likely to act in line with that attitude in that situations. Or an attitude could be chronically accessible, which is like it's got activated very frequently. Um, then you would also be more likely to act in line with it. But if you have an attitude, let's say like 10 years ago, and you don't really think about it, then your behavior would be less likely to align with that attitude. So there are also situations and person factors that would sort of influence how closely our behavior align with our attitude. So if you think back on our discussion of the Lewin's equations, behavior is a function of the person and environment, right? Then that makes sense, right? So let's consider the environment factor or situation factors. What if you have an attitude of loving recycling? What would make your behavior more likely to align with this attitude? The first factor is ease of behavior. So if it's easier to recycle, if uh, or harder, it will make you more likely or less likely to recycle. So, for example, if you want to recycle but there's no recycle bins around, you might go with like not recycling. Also, social norms. So, if you are in an environment that sort of support your attitude, then you're more likely to do it. And if you're in an environment where there's a social norm against, following against your attitude, then you might be less likely to do it. For example, if UNC campus is everyone is kind of like dislike recycle, there's the norms against recycling. I don't know why we would have that, but let's take that as an example. Then you might be less likely to recycle, even though you do hold a positive attitude toward recycling. Being observed affect whether we behave consistently with our attitude, especially if the observer known about our attitude. Why? Because we don't want to be viewed as hypocrite. So if you say that you love recycling and your friend know that, and then they see you putting trash, like a recyclable thrown away into like the trash can, you might be viewed as like a hypocrite. So you don't want that to happen. So you would actually more likely to recycle when there's a friend who's seen you doing that. So now let's talk about person factors. What is the factor at the person level that would affect behavior, attitude, consistency? The first factor is self-efficacy. So if we have an attitude that is really predictive of behavior, but also whether we actually do the behavior or not is related to whether we feel that we are capable of doing it or successfully doing it. So recycling is somewhat simple, right? So you just put things in. It's an easy behavior. So when we have an attitude, positive attitude about recycling, it's easy to just do it. But let's take another example. For example, if you have a positive attitude about composting, um, it it whether you actually compost or not would depends on your feelings of self-efficacy in the composting domain. For example, if you want to compost, you have to buy some composting equipment, or prepare some composting equipment, and you might have to know like the proportions of how much food stuff, sort of like food thrown away versus uh, dry leaves or wood chips to be mixing together, and that process, that like gap, that knowledge in order to like know those things can be kind of like a barrier. So you might potentially feel that you don't have high self-efficacy in terms of composting, and then you ended up not doing it, right? But if you feel like you are capable of doing a good compost, then your attitude will translate more readily into behavior. Um, so uh, another another person factor is whether you have a motivation to be consistent um, across your attitude and behavior. So which mean, are you motivated to kind of like keep your behavior and attitude consistent to avoid being a hypocrite? And the more the more you care about avoid being a hypocrite and being consistent, or like trying to keep your integrity, the more likely your attitude would align with your behavior. All right, so this is our essay options number 1. Feel free to pause and read it, and then resume the video. All right, so this is our learning outcome number 3. So we behave inconsistently with our attitude sometimes, and it sort of generate some repercussion. And one of the repercussion is described by the cognitive dissonance theory by Festinger in the 1950s. Basically, this theory say that when we have inconsistent cognitions and behavior, there is some kind of anxiety that arises from it, and we are motivated to reduce the anxiety by creating consistency. In other words, there is when there's inconsistency among attitudes, values, moral, or like behavior, then we're likely and we're motivated to resolve these inconsistency to achieve consistency. And this phenomena, this whole process, is can be described by the distant model with 3 steps. So the first step is that there is a conflict between among our cognitions, right? Among like different attitude, values, moral behavior, etc. For example, someone might think that someone might be a smoker, but also they know that smoking is bad for them. So there is some like conflict and cognitive dissonance right there. Or someone might hold an egalitarian beliefs, believe that we should help other people, elevate the less fortunate. Um, but they might see like some homeless person on the street asking for money or help, and they just kind of walk by and ignore them. Uh, and so the egalitarian attitude and not acting and the behavior is in conflict with each other. And so when we have these conflicts among between our cognitions, um, there it generate what what we call negative arousal or just negative emotions, but typically more high arousal negative emotions. Sometimes it's anxiety, sometimes it's kind of like frustrations and feeling bad because we have this inconsistent beliefs and behavior, and we don't like that. Um, so because we don't like these negative feelings or negative arousal, we're motivated to restore consistency. And so, for example, if a smoker kind of learn about how bad smoking is, but he's still smoking, he can restore consistency by quit smoking. Another way he might do it is by just kind of like ignore or trying to forget the health effect of smoking and trying to like avoid reading about how bad smoking is. That's another way. Another example is when student cheat during an exam, for example, that is in your conflict with their view of themselves as like a good person, an honest person, right? So how would we reduce the cognitive dissonance? The student might rationalize or might think that, well, the exam is not fair anyway, it's too hard, we're not prepared to take it. So that's one way to reduce cognitive dissonance. Um, and another example is if you hold an egalitarian attitude, but you sort of did not stop to help like a homeless person on the street, uh, you might sort of resolve that dissonance or try to reduce the negative arousal by donating to like different NGO, like the Salvation Army, for example, and then consistency is restored and we feel better afterward. So when there is inconsistency between attitudes and behavior, there are repercussions. And one repercussion is that we experience cognitive dissonance. There's a lot of hundreds of dissonance studies, but we're going to talk about a seminal study by Festinger and Carl-Smith in the 1950s. So I would like you guys to watch the videos of the experiment. It's really interesting and fun to watch. And then come back to this video lecture. All right, so assuming you have watched the video of the experiment, I'm just gonna do a quick recap. So the researchers had participants come into the lab and did a series of really boring tasks, and then they're asked to lie to the next participants, the next person, that the boring task is actually very fun and enjoyable for them. Um, and so the participants were assigned to 2 different groups. One group will pay $1 for lying, and the other group was paid $20 for lying. And then before the participant left the lab, after receiving the money, they were asked a couple more questions about their attitude toward the task, whether they find their experience doing these tasks enjoyable or fun, or would they do it again. Right? And so what the experimenter found is that the group that was paid only $1 um, thought that the experience of doing these tasks were kind of fun and more fun and enjoyable compared to the other group, and that they would be more likely to do that again. And the group that got paid $20, they rate the task as being more boring, or like they would be less likely to do it again. Why is this happening? The What happened was that by asking people to lie, the researcher created a dissonance because people want to see themselves as honest, good people, right? So, um, so by asking people to lie, they create uh, cognitive dissonance. And However, the group that got paid $20, and remember $20 is a lot of money in the 1950s. It created enough justification for lying. It's like, oh, I'm gonna, it's not a big deal. I'm making $20 for it, so I can lie about this. The group that only got paid $1 is really not good enough of a reason to lie to somebody. So, but so the people that got paid $1, um, what they did was they might have changed their memory of their experience. They might have remembered the task as being more interesting than it actually was, to sort of resolve the dissonance that, wow, I'm lying about this, but actually I did not, because I changed my memory. I actually remember that I find the task interesting and not boring. So I'm actually not lying. That might have been some sort of unconscious thought process going on. So this group of participants, because they remember the event differently, they were actually not lying. So that's how they resolve their cognitive dissonance. Um, so there's another study that sort of demonstrate the cognitive dissonance phenomenon. And this study is done by Aronson and Mill. It used the effort justification paradigm, right? So the participants in the study were led to believe that they they were being selected to join a social group, and the social group this social group is kind of selective because um, it talked about risque topics, so people have to be so comfortable talking about this topic in front of other people. So the participants would have to go through an initiation process. So here comes the manipulation. It's called the severity of initiation manipulation. So the researcher would sort of vary the how hard the initiation would be. And half of the participants would be assigned to read something from a book in front of other people. It's really boring, really like there's nothing much about it. The other half of participants are assigned to a high severity conditions where they have to read out loud explicit words and passages from like steamy romance novels, which were really embarrassing in front of other people. And so so those are like the two kind of initiations that people have to go through. Um, and then before joining the group, right, they would not join the group right away. After going through this initiation procedure, they would then listen to an audio recordings of a meeting of the group to kind of get a sense of that group. And the researcher makes sure that the audio recording which they made up is really boring. There's nothing interesting about the group. It's very tedious. Um, and which group do you think were more excited to join the social group? Which conditions? So the researcher found that the group that has to go to a severe initiation, that were, they have to be embarrassed, they have to overcome that. Um, Actually, even after they listened to a boring audio recording of the meeting of the groups, they were more excited to join compared to the other group. Um, so what happened here? So what happened is that when we put a lot of effort into something, and then we find out it's not worth it, it would generate negative arousal, right? It create dissonance, and so people will resolve that by changing their attitude. Or one way to resolve that is by changing their attitude about about that something to make our effort worthwhile. So in this case, the people who have to go through a hard initiation process, um, they change their attitude about the social group they're about to join. They feel like they're more committed and more excited about it, um, to be able to justify the amount of effort they had to go through. Right? And this doesn't necessarily happen at a conscious level. It could happen at a very unconscious level. And so this is a very like this phenomena is very similar to a lot of phenomena that we experience, in our in real life. If you think about hazings, it's a passage that a lot of different social groups use. It's a procedure that a lot of people have to go through to join certain social groups. um, and so a lot of time we would look at hazing and we think, well, that's a lot of effort, but it seems pointless. And in some case, even dangerous. For example, like last week, there's a college student in Ohio at Bowling Green State University uh, who died, during hazing into a fraternity. So because so it might seem kind of irrational and pointless, um, but that's exactly the point, right? Because the effort during hazing was not for very clear reasons. It is very possible that that caused people to justify uh, the effort by being developing more loyalty or commitment to the group. So this is not my endorsement of hazing or difficult initiation procedure. It's just an observations and kind of a way to think about what these kind of activity and behavior achieve and what it means, in terms of attitude and behavior consistency. All right, so this is our essay options number 2. This is our learning outcome number 4. So in the world of persuasion science, there's a saying that sort of encapsulate how researchers and scientists approach persuasions. It is who says what to whom. So this saying represents 3 factors that influence persuasions: the source of persuasions, the person who make the persuasive message, who try to convince other people to do something; the what, which is the message itself, right? What are the characteristics of the message that would compel people to do something? And the whom, who is the target of the persuasive effort. So let's talk about the who first, the persuasive source. There are characteristics of the source, of the persuasive source, that make us more or less likely to be persuaded. So if the person who's trying to persuade us, or trying to persuade someone, is attractive, is similar to the person who's they trying to persuade is likable and is an expert in the domain, they're more likely to be persuasive. We're more likely to listen to them if they're trying to persuade us. So these all make sense, right? If they feel, if we feel like they're similar to us, we're more likely to listen to them. Um, if they're likable, if they're an expert about it, we're also more likely to respect their authority uh, on the matter. So, questions for you guys: do any of these characteristics have anything to do with the actual argument that they give you if they're trying to change your mind? Not really, right? These All of these characteristics are sort of peripheral or unrelated to the actual persuasive message, but they still have an effect on how likely we are to be persuaded anyway. Right? So yeah, if you think about, the next time you want to buy something and you see an ad, or you want to buy a car and talk to a car salesman, um, these things might likely be at play that affect whether you would buy a product or not. So now we talk about the who. Let's talk about the what. The what represent, the characteristic of persuasive message. So uh, a message are found to be more persuasive if yeah, if have strong logical argument, if they represent a good argument with statistic and clear reasonings, people are more likely to be persuaded. Um, in addition to strong argument or clear reasoning, if the message have a story to go with it, it would be stronger. And so there's a field of research on narrative transportations. And basically, it's referred to the degree to which people get engaged and engrossed in a story. And that would predict how likely people are to be persuaded by the story, or would, kind of go along with the story. So if we have a story to go with our message, it will be more effective, um, especially when people can identify with the story, when they kind of like engage with the story. Primacy and recency. So in a message, maybe we have a lot of arguments. The thing that appear the first in the message, or like the first arguments, would have a stronger would have a strong effect compared to something that appear in the middle. So first impressions, or things that come first, is especially important. So a tips: put your strongest argument first in your message. And then another important temporal point in your persuasion effort is recency. So the most recent thing would be more likely to affect your attitude than something that happened like further away. So again, if you deliver, if you have like an essay, or you have a speech to persuade um, someone to do something, you might put one of your strong argument at the end as well, or you might restate your strongest argument at the end. Um, and finally, the speed of the message is also important. Um, so when the message is delivered a little bit faster, it make people more likely to be persuaded, even though it's the same exact message. And because people associated fast talking with more confidence and more sort of like knowledge, they assume that people who talk faster would be more confident and have more knowledge about the subject matter. All right. So now that you've learned about, all the who, what, and who factors in persuasion, this is our essay option number 3. This is our learning outcome number 5. So Sun Tzu, the author of the famous Art of War, has a saying: If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. So we can apply, know your enemy philosophy to changing someone's attitude. If you know how your attitude change target or thinking, and so you will know what they're attending to, and as you know how they're thinking and what they're paying attention to, you can try to control that and successfully persuade them. So with that in mind, let's talk about the dual process model of persuasions. So this model outlined the process and the different way that people would process the persuasive messages. Right. So let's imagine we're trying to persuade this person about something. So this is our target of persuasion. The first questions we want to ask ourselves, the first questions we want to know is whether this person is motivated to think about our persuasion message. For example, if we want to persuade her on recycling, does she even care about recycling? Is she motivated to think about recycling? And if she's not motivated to think about it, for example, because it's not personally relevant to her, she finds the topic boring, or she's pursuing other goals and she doesn't want to think about this, then we would know she would process our message more superficially, or in other words, her processing style of this message, of this persuasion effort, would be superficial processing. And the type of informations she pay attention to would be more peripheral informations, or non-central, not relevant to the arguments we're making. So this information would be like cues or heuristic. Like, for example, whether we are likable, because we're the source of persuasions, right? She would pay attention to information such as whether we're likable, whether we're similar to her, or whether there's some other environmental cues that would make our message more acceptable to her. And then the next questions we want to ask is, if she's motivated to think about our message, does she has the necessary cognitive resources to process the message? Or in other words, does she have the working memory capacity to process the message carefully? If not, for example, if she has, ego depletions because she's spending a lot of cognitive resources on some other tasks, or when she's under cognitive load, she's having to process some, maybe she's doing some math problem and we're trying to persuade her at the same time, or maybe she's feel tired, stressed, or drunk. This person would not have the necessary cognitive resources to process a persuasion message, process the argument of the persuasion message, right? Then if she doesn't have it, then she would also has a superficial processing style of the persuasive message. And she would also pay attention to more peripheral information such as cue and heuristic. However, if she's motivated to think about the persuasive issues and she has the cognitive resources to process the persuasive message, then her processing style would be thoughtful processing. It means that she would have the ability and the motivation to think about the persuasive message in a deliberate way and critical way. And so the type of informations she would pay attention to would be the argument itself. For example, like the reasoning or the statistic presented in the argument. And so superficial processing and thoughtful processing is how this person are thinking about the persuasion's issues. And the type of informations they use are represent the type of information that they're paying attention to. So to kind of like reiterate this and to sort of distinguish, to help you guys distinguish between how people are thinking and what they're paying attention to. Let's recap this. So for thoughtful processing, right, it's the way that people are thinking, how they're thinking. And for what they're paying attention to, this style of thinking, people, when they have it, they would pay attention to relevant argument information. For example, if you're trying to, sell a car to someone, and they're processing your persuasive message more in a more thoughtful, deliberate way, they would pay attention to information such as how much does it cost, what are the features, what is the data, and the analysis of cost benefit of buying this car. However, if they process the information in a superficial way, which is how the thinking is superficial processing, then they would pay attention to information such as cue and heuristic. So the cue or heuristic example could be: is the person pitching this idea attractive? Are they likable, similar to me? The information could be emotions. How do I feel right now? Does complying with this person, or does doing this thing that the persuader trying to get me to do make me feel good? Or does this message of persuasion support my confirmation biases? An example. So the first style of processing, thoughtful processing, happen when the person is motivated and have the cognitive resources to process the message in a thoughtful and careful way. The second style of processing, superficial processing, happens when the person is not motivated to process the information carefully, or does not have the cognitive resources to do that. So an example of superficial processing situation is, for example, political posts. Right, when a person see a post on Facebook, on social media, about some like outrageous event or something like that. And if they're not motivated to process the information carefully, or maybe they don't have the cognitive resources to process it, maybe they're too tired after a long work day, etc., they might just kind of support the post or be persuaded by a post that align with their previous belief, right? And make them feel good. So they might just like repost the post without fact checking, without thinking about the post critically. And that's how a lot of informations on political informations and misinformation got spread, because people don't have like the motivation or the cognitive resources to process it carefully in certain situations. And with that, this is our essay options number 3. Feel free to pause and resume the video lectures when you finish reading it. This is our learning outcome number 6. All right, so let's talk about some attitude change techniques, some compliant techniques that we can apply to affect people's attitude and behavior. The first one, we actually have discussed that in previous lecture, is we could apply self-perception theory, which basically say that we look to our past or present behavior in order to inform our attitudes. So what we do would actually inform how we perceive ourselves and inform how we think about things. So for example, if we could use this self-perception theory to persuade people to think of some behaviors, or even better, to engage in that behaviors consistent with the attitude that you want them to develop, then people are more likely to gradually adopt that attitude. For example, on college campus, um, typically the recycle bins are put right at the door. So this sort of nudges people toward recycling consistently, right? Because it's so convenient, so people just sort of like recycle. Um, and as people do that consistently, it changed their self-identity, and it changed their attitude toward recycling, because people think that, oh, I've been recycling, I must love recycling, and I must be a recyclist. Therefore, small behavior, if we can get people to think about or engage in small behavior consistently, it would change their attitude about that topic. Another technique to change someone's attitude, use the principle of reciprocity, which basically say that if I do something for people, they'll do something for me. And reciprocity is actually a social norm that evolved throughout human evolutionary history, or even animal evolutions. It's crucial. Reciprocity is crucial for the survival of a social group, because it motivates individual to reciprocate the help that they receive, and thus ensure that the group would survive and flourish, because individuals look out for one another. So um, you might see an example of reciprocity in a lot of domain of persuasions. One example is, I don't know if this ever happened to you, but maybe you're walking on the street, and then someone from an NGO or an organization approach you, and then first they start off by giving you a small gift, like a token or some candy. Yeah, that sounds a little sus. And then that would make you feel kind of a sense of like indebtedness, right? They did something for me. So then you would feel kind of at least the need to entertain a conversation with them, or sign petitions, or to donate to their organizations. So that's how reciprocity works for persuasions. A study that demonstrated this principle was conducted by Reagan in the 1970s. And what the researcher did was that they had participants come into the lab, and they would be waiting with a Confederate in the waiting room, where it's actually how the experiment goes, but they were told that they need to be waiting for the experiment to start. And so the researcher manipulated how likable the Confederate were. So the Confederate may have acted sort of in an unlikable way or likable way. And then that's the first independent variable. They also manipulated whether the Confederate would do a favor for the participant. So in one condition, the Confederate would buy something from the vending machine, and they just buy like one extra coat, and they would tell the participants that, hey, I have an extra coke, I don't want to drink it, do you want it? Right. So in that condition, the Confederate did some favor for the participant. In the other conditions, the Confederate didn't do anything for the participant. Okay. So at the end of the study, the Confederate asked the participants, hey, I'm trying to sell some raffle ticket, do you want to buy some? And what is the result of this study? The result of the study showed that the likability did not matter as much. The likability of the Confederate, right, did not matter as much for the persuasion effort um, to sell the raffle ticket to the participants. It is the reciprocity norm that mattered. So when the Confederate sort of offer a coat in advance, the uh, the people, the participants, were more likely to buy more raffle tickets. So reciprocity norms sort of overcome the effect of likability of this Confederate event. So another attitude change technique, which is kind of similar to reciprocity, is called door in the face. This technique was studied by Robert Cialdini in the 1970s. He's actually was a Tar Heel. He went to grad school at UNC. and he's one of the biggest, probably like the pioneer of persuasion research. So definitely look him up. So the study that he used to demonstrate the door interface technique is the juvenile delinquent study. So the participants in the study were approached by the researchers, and these participants were college students. They were asked for a favor. Hey, so in one of the group, they were asked like, hey, would you be willing to spend 2 hours this weekend to kind of accompany a group of juvenile delinquents to the zoo, kind of a volunteer social activities. And so, and the other group were approached, but they were not asked for this request first. They were asked that would you be willing to spend some hours for every weekend in the next 2 months to volunteer to help with juvenile delinquents. And so 100% of the participants in this group say, no, I'm not going to do that. That's a lot of commitment. Right? And so then the researchers sort of back down. Okay, well, you don't have to do that, but would you be willing to spend 2 hours to accompany a group of juvenile delinquents to the zoo this weekend? So the result is that, well, in the first group, when the request was asked right away, 17% of people agree to the request. But in the second group, when the researcher used door in the face technique, right, when they start high and then back down the request, 51% of participants agree to the second request. So it's triple the rate of response from the first experimental conditions. So that's pretty amazing. Why did this door in the face technique work? So there's two mechanisms, there's two explanations. One is perceptual contrast. Because we're contrasting the request to different anchor, different comparisons point. The request might seem bigger or smaller. So if you look at this image, right, which black dot do you feel is bigger? The first one, right? However, they're all the same size, but the first black dot seems bigger, the second one seems smaller, because they were compared to different like white circle. And in the same way, when a request is compared to like a much bigger request, that request seems smaller. The second mechanism is reciprocity. And so how reciprocity works is because the researchers start with a big request and then they back down. And so by backing down, it feels like the researchers or the requesters is doing a favor for the other person, right? When we ask somebody for something and they say no, and when we back down, getting less than what we originally wanted is kind of a form of a favor. It's a form of gift to the other person. So it makes the other person feel the need to reciprocate that by agreeing to the request or by sort of like, trying to meet us in the middle. So the final attitude change technique we're going to talk about is the foot in the door technique. So this technique may sound similar to door in the face, but it's used an opposite approach. And how it works is that the persuader would start with a small request to be able to gain compliance. And as time passed, they would ask for a larger request. So how does this work? This technique functions based on getting people to make an initial commitment on a small request. And once they're publicly committed to the cause, right, they feel the pressure to stay consistent, to avoid inconsistency and avoid cognitive dissonance. So they're more likely to comply to larger requests. This technique is similar to lowball, which is start with a small request to get people to commit it and then change the request. at last minute. So let's talk about the foot in the door, the evidence for foot in the door technique first. And the evidence is provided by a seminal study by Freeman and Fraser in the 1960s. So in the experiment, they had a male experimenter contacted several suburban housewives in their homes, and he would identify himself as a member of, a committee, the committee for traffic safety or the committee to keep California beautiful. And so he would approach these people and ask if they would agree to display a small sign in their yard. And it's kind of an innocuous request because the sign would say, please drive safe or keep California beautiful. Right? It's kind of a small innocuous request. And so most of the participants would agree to this request. And then a while later, he would follow up and ask if they could display an 8 by 10 feet billboard in their yard saying the same message. So that's the first condition. In the second condition, so half of the participants would be asked straight away. Can we, he would approach the other half of participants and ask if he could put 8 feet by 10 feet billboard in the yard saying the same message. So in one condition, participants were asked with a small favor first and then follow up with a billboard request. In the other conditions, they were only asked with a billboard request. And the result shows that when people were only asked about whether they would be willing to display the billboard, only 16% of them agreed. But in the other group that had already committed to the cause with a small request, 76% of them agreed to put the billboard. Right, that is an enormous increase, showing how effective this method is. So why does it work? Again, it's because people has made a small commitment and feel the pressure to stay consistent. And when they start small and as time passes, they start to incorporate this new behavior into their self-schema. Right? We start to incorporate a new behavior, however small, into our self-identity. So we feel more compelled to do bigger behavior that consistent with the small behavior that we committed to. So the low ball technique is similar, but it's different slightly from the foot in the door technique. Is that in the low ball technique, let's take an example of a car dealer. Right? For the low ball technique, the car dealer might try to get people to commit by giving them a really good deal at the beginning. For example, let's say you're trying to buy a car and you see an ad saying that they're selling this car for like $5,000. The car is really wonderful. It has all these, it has all these features. It's new, it's well maintained, etc. And then you come and see this car, and the car dealer would let you drive in the car and get you to like almost wanting to buy the car. And at the last minute, once you say, oh yeah, I really want to buy this car, they change the term, right? So the commitment start to like grow legs. They might tell you that there's an actual mistake. The actual price, not $5,000, maybe it's like $10,000-$15,000 actually. And so they changed the deal after giving you a low ball. And that happened after we feel like we're already committed to buying this thing or doing this request. So they take advantage of the fact that people don't want to change a prior commitment. And so even though they change the term, people are still likely to kind of like trying to keep their commitment because they don't want to change it. So that's how the low ball technique works. It's a little slimy, but it's used a lot in advertisement and sales. So definitely look out for them. All right, so that's the last attitude change technique. That's it for this module.